Hello, this is Mote, and I'm going to show you a quick A/B test, which is the same score recorded in two different ways compared directly side by side. This isn't something you'd get very often. Usually you'd only hear the finished product, but this time I'm going to show you the difference between a score which was recorded live with a real cello and a score, and the same score recorded using a MIDI instrument cello, so a software synthesized cello, which was recorded with real samples but is then put into a programmable instrument. So I actually think that the difference is huge between these two things, and if anyone is ever wondering whether to perhaps set aside budget for their recording, or to set aside budget for the music in their film, game, whatever, then I would highly recommend it, and hopefully this will help people to see why. So I'm going to start off, and each time I'm going to show you the real cello, I'm going to show you the MIDI cello first and the real cello second. It's also good to know that the MIDI cello was recorded using an electric cello, whereas the real live recorded cello was recorded using an acoustic cello with a big hollow body, which uses a microphone to record, whereas the electric cello uses a pickup to record. So the process is quite different, and that should also be considered when making comparisons like this one. So first example, here is the MIDI cello. So you can hear how that sounds, and now we're going over to the real cello. And that really is a very different performance. You can hear how the note expression changes, how it rises and falls in volume during the note, and also in his vibrato expression too, which just doesn't happen in the MIDI instrument. And I would also say at this point that I specifically said in my instructions to him for the recording to use relatively little vibrato, but you can see how a real player understands that differently compared to how I program the MIDI instrument. The real player with the cello interprets that instruction differently and uses it more effectively, and uses vibrato still where it's needed, but tastefully. And I think that difference is very, very pronounced between a professional person playing the instrument and me, the composer, just programming a MIDI instrument. I will never be able to reach the same level of understanding of the instrument and of its expression as the real player. So moving on to the second example, again we have the MIDI cello first. Now the real recorded cello. There is I'm sure you can hear there's a huge difference there. I'm going to show you that again, but switching in between the two performances whilst they're playing, just to give you a better idea of quite how pronounced that difference is. So So hopefully that gives you an even better image of quite how different those two performances are. They're obviously playing the same notes at roughly the same volume in roughly the same way. They interpret it very differently. The real cello has this great slide from one note to the other going on, which you can hear. And it gives it this evil sort of undertone, and it's very dark, and that's exactly what the score was going for. And the player clearly understands that very well. And here again. And that's a level of expression which just doesn't occur in the MIDI instrument. And even if it's possible in the MIDI instrument, which it may be, maybe my programming wasn't quite diligent enough, the real player just understands it and will add that in as something which the score needs, because he has an innate understanding of how to make the music sound as it's meant to sound, whereas the MIDI instrument just doesn't. It doesn't do anything that I don't tell it to do. So in that way, again, the real player adds initiative and understanding of the score. So let's move on to the next section. MIDI cello. Real cello. Again, the vibrato and the rise and fall in the note expression shows a really huge difference. And interestingly enough, you can also hear some discrepancy between what's played and what I wanted the player to play, which is one of the few downsides of recording with a real musician. They're gonna be reading a score which can have mistakes in it, and which then gets embedded into the recording, whereas I can tweak the MIDI as I go along. So that just needs a little bit more proofreading in the score. But you can hear right at this point, those notes are meant to be the same length, and in the MIDI recording they actually are. Whereas not so much in the real recording. And that's just a minor issue which is easily resolved through slightly better proofreading. But I actually proofread my own score for this, which is never a good idea. Always get someone else to proofread your score, because you can't really do it to yourself in the same way. So next example, again, MIDI cello. Anyone who's unsure what they're looking for there, it's that scratchy, fast bowed underlayer. Real cello. You can hear there how the real player varies the bowing speed, so how fast he's bowing the note as it builds through the different notes, whereas the MIDI instrument, often how this kind of thing is done on MIDI instruments is it's a looped sample, so the sample plays over and over again as long as you hold the note down, so it doesn't get that natural variation. And of course, again, the MIDI instrument doesn't understand tension and resolution, build and rise and fall in the same way the real player does. So the real player puts all this great expression on. I'm going to show you again, and I'm going to switch between them during the performance just so you can hear that difference more clearly. So it's really apparent there. And one final example right here, MIDI cello first. Real cello. Now the real cello hits this kind of great climax as it goes from one note to the other, which is, of course, just a lot flatter in the MIDI version. It doesn't come through in the same way. I'm going to show you those directly switched between the two again, so you can really hear that difference come through. So there's that flatness to the MIDI performance, which just, again, it is partly programming, but the real player, you don't need to program the real player. The real player knows exactly how to play the music to make it sound its best, as long as your instructions and score are good enough, which a MIDI instrument just doesn't do. A real player is there to understand his instrument in a way that the composer just wouldn't necessarily be able to. So I hope that gives you an idea of exactly what the difference is between getting someone to really play the instrument on a score and between programming it yourself in a MIDI instrument. The MIDI instrument is often the, almost invariably by far the cheaper solution, but I think that it should be fairly apparent after listening to this, and this is even just with one cello, this isn't like a whole orchestra or anything like that. It should be fairly apparent when listening to this that the difference is huge and really can make the difference between a score which stands out and sounds fantastic and atmospheric versus one which just doesn't do the job in the same way. So thanks very much for listening to this real cello versus MIDI cello A/B demonstration.